Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Christ, the Conqueror of Hell, by Alfeyev, published in 2009. This is our penultimate lesson. This is only a 101-page monograph, so this is the penultimate lesson, one more lesson after this. And we'll take a look at pages 75 to 85, and we kind of get to the definitive Eastern position and a brief look at the Western tradition in this lesson, and it will continue the Western tradition in the final lesson after this. Let's go to block 1, pseudepigrapha and genuine writings from the 5th to the 8th century. John the Notorious of Syria wrote using other established names. In other words, they were pseudepigrapha documents, including the following 4 homilies. He had a homily on John the Baptist, descending into Hades, appearing to the prophets who recited their prophecies concerning Christ, a homily on Judas as a dialogue between Hades and Satan, and a homily on the death and resurrection of Christ, and a homily on the passion of the Lord. Now, Epiphanius of Cyprus, where there was a homily on Great Saturday, but it was a pseudepigrapha document. It was actually dated in the 7th century. It divides the inhabitants of Hades into 2 groups, those who recognize Christ and those who do not. Now, we have a genuine document here in Cyril of Alexandria, 376 to 444 AD, late 4th century. He wrote the Paschal homilies, and from his text, having destroyed hell, he opened the impassable gates for the departed spirits. Then he left the devil abandoned and lonely. Cyril of Alexandria considered the preaching in Hades to be the fulfillment of the history of salvation, which began with the incarnation. So for Cyril of Alexandria, the history of salvation became incarnation and descent into Hades both. Now, block 2, we look at 7th century testimony and teaching. And these are very prominent figures in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Extremely important figures. We've got Maximus the Confessor, John Damascene, John Chrysostom, all extremely important individuals. So block 2, note 1, Maximus the Confessor, 580 to 662 AD. Maximus the Confessor. He begins with 1 Peter 4:6. This is why the gospel was preached even to the dead, who were judged according to the flesh, so they might live according to God by the Spirit, even unto the guilty, not just the righteous, so they could live by the Spirit. Therefore, their time in Hades for Maximus had a reforming nature. Now, St. John Damascene, 7th century. He represents the Eastern Orthodox position today. From his text, we read, "The soul of Christ, as deified, descended into Hades, that the Son of Righteousness might bring light to those seated in the shadow of death. And he became to those who believed, and to those who had their unbelief overcome, he became the author of salvation." Now, Alfeyev also includes a few comments on Romans 8, 29 and 30, the famous passage on predestination. And so he says this was addressed by John Chrysostom in the 4th century. all will not be saved, because salvation includes the following: the non-coercive call of God and the responding will of those called. Not all will follow the call. So, even if there is a universal predestination for John Chrysostom, there's no universal salvation, because the response of the free will is necessary. The decision to follow Christ is mandatory, said Chrysostom. Now, John Damascene, Block 2, Note 2 there, that represents the current Eastern Orthodox view today about the descent. We close out with a look at a few Western writers in Block 3. St. Hilarius, St. Jerome, and Aurelius Prudentius. Let's go to Block 3. Hilarius, the 4th century Bishop of Rome. By Christ's death, he destroys the gates of brass and the bars of iron, to redeem those created in his image. In Christ's ascent, death and corruption were obliterated. Man is carried back to heaven. And then we have St. Jerome, the Latin theologian of the 4th century. O death, you did swallow up Jonah, but he still lived. And by his death, Christ, we shall live. Jerome identified Abraham's bosom with hell, but after Christ's resurrection, the Old Testament righteous were delivered, says Jerome. And then we finish with Aurelius Prudentius, a 5th century Latin monk. Even souls lost in the depth of hell have deliverance from the descent of Christ, that the dead might know salvation. To Christ so yielded the broken gates of Hades. So in this penultimate lesson, we see that in the 5th to the 8th centuries, a lot of false documents evolved. Documents written in a pseudonym, so from the 5th to the 8th century had a lot of pseudepigrapha, not genuine documents, but documents that borrowed significant names that research has shown to be pseudo names, not genuine writings. That was the trend in the 5th to the 8th century. But then in Block 2, the genuine position held by the Eastern Orthodox Church, they are very much in alignment, on many doctrines, but they're in alignment with Maximus the Confessor and John Damascene. That is who they go to today. And so let's take a look at 2:1 and 2 again, because it defines the Eastern Orthodox position. Maximus the Confessor. He began with 1 Peter 4:6. This is why the gospel was preached even to the dead, who were judged according to the flesh, so they might live according to God by the Spirit, even unto the guilty, not just the righteous, so they could live by the Spirit. Therefore, their time in Hades had a reforming nature. And then John Damascene, 7th century. And we read with the text, the soul of Christ as deified, that's theosis for Eastern Orthodox, he descended into Hades, that the Son of Righteousness might bring light to those seated in the shadow of death. And he became to those who believed, and he became to those who had their unbelief overcome, the author of salvation. The author of salvation. Those two figures are the most prominent support from the Church Fathers for the Eastern Orthodox position on the descent into Hades today. That is their position. We don't have the definitive Western position in this lesson. That's going to come in the final lesson, because I know for sure we're going to get into Augustine, so I did take a peek, and we are going to be getting into Augustine before this wraps up on page 101. The second half of the book consists of a group of liturgies that are used by the Eastern Orthodox Church. So the actual teaching is a 101-page monograph. And that's going to be next time. We're going to take the final lesson. It'll be page 87 to 101. So next time, 87 to 101, this is our penultimate lesson. It wraps up pages 75 to 85. And it gave us a good look at the current Eastern Orthodox position in Maximus the Confessor and St. John Damascene. So it did give us the definitive Eastern position, and we will find the definitive Western position in the final lesson, which we're actually going to begin at 87 and go to the end 101. So 87 to 101 for the final lesson. That's going to wrap up 75 to 85 on Christ the Conqueror of Hell.